Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Gentry Patrick, and I'm a professor at UC San Diego in the section of Neurobiology, Division of Biological Sciences. As a member of the Action Collaborative on Neuroscience Training and initiative of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's Forum on Neuroscience and Nervous System Disorders, I'd like to welcome you all to this virtual workshop on racial justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion in neuroscience training. This meeting is being convened by the Neuroscience Forum, and it's the first in a series of virtual workshops aimed at illuminating critical issues in neuroscience training and providing a venue for sharing ways to move forward. The relevance of this workshop is timely and much needed. When you consider the state of our world today, it may seem that you're living in a bad dream. For many, it's a nightmare, but in an instance, reality wakes you back up. Yes, this is our truth, our personal and collective reality, where we must juxtapose our scientific curiosity, intellect, and drive in neuroscience into making the world a healthier and better place for all, to a new and deadly pandemic, and to an old and tiresome tale of racism and police brutality against already marginalized members of our community. I'd like to thank the collaborative members and panelists all for their hard work in putting this amazing panel together for you today. The panelists' biographies are available in the meeting handouts, which you can download from the event. Racial justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Excuse me. I lost my. Racial justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion are critical issues that cross all aspects of neuroscience training and have tremendous implication for trainees, mentors, and the future of the field. This virtual workshop will provide personal experiences on the training process and explore how institutions are approaching these areas to bring about positive change. So we're going to have two panels. Panel one will be moderated by myself. It'll be personal experiences on neuroscience training, a conversation. Panel two will be the institutional perspectives on approaching diversity, equity, and inclusion in training, meeting this moment to listen, assess, and drive real change. And that will be moderated by Dr. Michelle Jones-London. A short proceedings document of the presentations and discussions from this workshop will be prepared to reflect what transpired at the workshop. It will be published by the National Academies Press and will be publicly available. All views presented in this report will be those of workshop participants. The report will not contain consensus recommendation. Throughout the workshop, there will be opportunities for attendees to ask questions, and we encourage you to do so through the question and answer box located on the workshop event page below the live broadcast. If you would like to direct your question to specific panelists, please do so by typing at the panelist's name followed by your question. We will be using the same platform for the online discussion following the workshop from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We encourage everyone to participate. So now I'm going to transition to our first panel. Let me first give a brief introduction, let everyone say hello. We first have our panelist, Dr. Daniel COLÓN-RAMOS, who is the Doris McConnell Duberg Professor of Neuroscience and Cell Biology at Yale University School of Medicine. Daniel.
Patrick, thank you. Gentry, thank you a lot for that introduction. My name is Daniel COLÓN-RAMOS. I was born and raised in Puerto Rico. I'm a professor here at Yale University, where my lab studies the cell biology of the synapse. Besides my research work, I'm very passionate about democratizing access to science based on my own experiences having been born and raised in Puerto Rico, and just based on how I think science should work. I'm very excited to be here today. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next, we have Dr. KIMBERLEI Richardson, who is an associate professor in the Department of Pharmacology at Howard University College of Medicine. KIMBERLEI.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Kimberlei Richardson. I am an associate professor in the Department of Pharmacology at Howard University College of Medicine. Our lab focuses on the neural control of motivated behaviors, specifically neuropeptide regulation in drug-seeking and feeding behaviors. I'm grateful to be a part of this important discussion. I have dedicated a large portion of the time at Howard in terms of training and mentoring underrepresented minorities, and also being a part of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. So very happy to be here today.
Great, thank you so much. And last but not least, we have Dr. KAELA Singleton, who is a developmental neuroscientist, completing her postdoctoral training with Dr. Victor Funduz at Emory University. I may have butchered that name, I'm sorry.
Hi, I'm Dr. KAELA Singleton. I'm a postdoc in Dr. Victor Funduz's lab at Emory University, and I'm an adjunct professor at Agnes Scott College and a first or active teaching fellow and a DSPAN F99K00 scholar. My research focuses on how neurons are made during development, but also in healthy conditions and pathological conditions. And I strongly believe that the formation of the nervous system is really similar to the formation of creating successful, productive researchers. And so my research interests are rooted in my career goals to promote diversity, equity, inclusion, but also representation and accountability in neuroscience in general. And I'm super happy to be here.
Great, great, thank you. Okay, so the format of this panel, it's a conversation. We're gonna share, we're gonna learn. This is an open conversation. It's personal stories and reflection. Of course, our time will fly by, but we hope to leave at least 10 to 15 minutes for question and answers at the end of this first panel. And again, we encourage everyone to participate in the online discussion afterwards and directing questions to specific panelists or to everyone. So why this conversation and why now? George Floyd's shocking murder at the end of May lit a match on a tinderbox of issues and resulted unrest has opened a national conversation and broader awakening on the role of systemic racism in all parts of our society, including in science and STEM. As importantly, it stimulated for many of us personal and community reflections. In the wake of these events, many of us have felt a range of emotions from grief, sadness, anger to exhaustion, but also energy, commitment, resilience, and the strength to contribute to change. The goal of this conversation today is just to open up a broader conversation with all of you, a time to listen, a time to learn, and a time to reflect. We see this as a starting point for an ongoing discussion around ways we as scientists and a community can stand up against racism and support diversity, equity, and inclusion here in neuroscience and academia, in our local communities, and in the broader world. Importantly, we hope that this conversation will lead to real action for change. Okay, so let's get started. My first question is for Daniel. Daniel, why does identity matter? And why is it important to eliminate institutionalized racism and structures that force minoritized scientists to choose between their identities?
Thanks, Gentry. So what I will share based on my own experiences, but also, I mean, as a scientist and as a trainer, but also when I was a trainee, is that scientists come from somewhere. All scientists come from somewhere. And that somewhere influences who we are as human beings, and therefore it influences what our interests are, and as such, it influences science. And sometimes people have a hard time with this concept as scientists because they say, well, isn't science supposed to be universal? And while the concepts that emerge from scientific research are universal in that they should be applicable to many different contexts, and while our interest in science is based on a fundamental kind of instinct, a common humanity, a common aspiration to understand, how we get there is very specific to the individual, and that influences what kind of questions we're interested in, and what kind of questions get asked, what kind of questions get answered, how they get asked and answered, who gets influenced by those answers, etc. And that results in all sorts, when you don't have a recognition of that fact, that scientists come from somewhere and that influences science, that results in all sorts of disparities that, like, further downstream, that takes all sorts of forms, including racism. There is a quote by a Puerto Rican author that I actually really like. I heard Mayra Montero, who's this writer, once say that Puerto Ricans needed to write their own stories. And if we didn't develop our voices to write our own stories, the world was incomplete. So the fact that our voices were not part of that global narrative, the lack of those stories made not only for our invisibility, but also the world was less. And I will argue similarly, when scientists from different backgrounds, when science doesn't have spaces for scientists from different backgrounds to be able to fully participate and benefit from the scientific enterprise, the world is less, science is less. The questions that we are asking are less. The discoveries that we're making, the impact that it can have, they're diminished by our biases and by the institutionalized forms of racism that might be excluding those voices. And lastly, I will say that not recognizing that scientists come from somewhere in science is a form of white supremacy. And the reason I say that, and those are strong words, but I say it blatantly, is because it reminds me a little bit when I was growing up in Puerto Rico, and I thought that Puerto Ricans didn't have an accent. And I thought so because all the Puerto Ricans that I knew spoke similarly. So I thought, well, Puerto Ricans don't have an accent. And it took me leaving Puerto Rico to realize, wait a second, everyone that I was around had an accent. They just had a Puerto Rican accent. So I like to use accents as an analogy. I was giving a talk and I asked an audience of students to raise their hands if they didn't have an accent. And most of the audience raised their hand. And I kept on repeating the question until everyone lowered their hand. And I said, that's right. You might have an American accent, but you have an accent. You might have a white identity, but you have an identity. You have the identity of the majority. So if you think that identity doesn't matter, the only way that you can arrive at that conclusion, based on the human experience from my standpoint, is by having the identity of the majority and thinking that no other identities matter. And that, in my book, is a form of white supremacy.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. So I would say for the audience that the panelists and myself had a chance to chat a bit before. And so I do have a little insight into some of the things that they've been thinking about. And the next question, which is for KAELA, I couldn't help but ask this question since you brought it up in the discussion. So congrats on your recent defense and completion of your PhD. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience, and in particular, how Beyonce's documentary, Homecoming, helped you get to the finish line? And by the way, everyone should watch that documentary. If they haven't, they should. And how does this relate to your identity and the power of Black women in STEM and academia?
Yeah, thank you so much. I obviously love talking about Beyonce. So, I defended in May of this year, so I am newly Dr. Singleton. But prior to that, Homecoming came out on April 17th, 2019, or April 18th, it doesn't matter. And on that day, I had a committee meeting, and I was a fifth-year graduate student. I had just gotten the F99 K00, and I was really excited, but I was also really ready to be done with graduate school. But I had been in a bad place for a while, going through like mentorship changes and project changes and just natural science discourse of like things not working that should be working. And so I went into this committee meeting, and to be super frank with you, it just sucked. It was bad. I was bad. I wasn't prepared for it. Emotionally, mentally, spiritually, like it was not a good idea. And so I went home and I did what any true Beyonce fan would do. I ordered like $60 worth of Chinese food, and I watched Homecoming on repeat for, I think I watched it 3 times. I watched it by myself with my roommates, and then right before I went to bed again. And I normally talk about this documentary in terms of finding a mentor, because I think Beyonce is a great role model, and that can be a conversation for another time. But in this instance, Beyonce really helped me realize what I needed to leave graduate school. And so much like Beyonce, I did not attend an HBCU. I went to an all-women's college. that was a minority serving institution, Agnes Scott College, and it was a great experience. I learned so much about myself, so much about the patriarchy and women, but I didn't have Black professors. I've never had a Black professor, a Black teacher, a Black mentor, not a direct one. And in watching Homecoming, when watching Homecoming, Beyonce has this monologue where she talks about what she wanted the performers and the vocalists and the step artists to feel. And she wanted them to feel pride, not just in the show, but in the process, in the struggles, in the imperfections, in the 12-hour rehearsals. She wanted them to be thankful for their curves, their sass, their identity, and the things that they bring to the table to make that performance possible. And for me, a Black queer woman who had never had a mentor that even kind of looked like me, that was something that I needed to hear. I needed another Black woman to tell me that it was okay to be my full self, to walk into rooms and not shrink myself or make myself small, to be proud of not just my successes, right? Not just my grants and my fellowships, but of my failures, of my bad Western blots, of the things that I had learned, and to show pride in my Blackness and who I am. And so part of the reason that I stay in academia and that I decided to do my postdoc was to do that and to give that voice to other people. And I think most importantly, what that documentary gave me was a sense of belonging and purpose. And even though Beyonce is not a scientist, as far as I know, she could be, she gave me an analogy and a metaphor that worked for me. And so I woke up one day and I was like, I'm going to be the Beyonce of neuroscience. I'm going to instill in other people what Beyonce gave me, dancing in my living room, eating a spring roll, compassion and entertainment and joy and happiness and validity in my experience as a Black woman. And I think to Daniel's point earlier, when you talk about identity, if you don't include the intersectionality of identity, so I'm a Black queer woman, I'm not just a Black woman. When you lose that identity, when I lose or erase my queerness or make it smaller, I lose a part of who I am. I become inauthentic. And so I'm trying to fit into this box that wasn't made for me to grow as much as I should. And so that's how Beyonce helps me daily.
Right. You spoke a bit about intersectionality, and maybe you can add a little bit more. Diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, they often neglect intersectionality, and in many cases that leads to their failure. Can you speak a bit about that and what you've identified there?
Yeah, so I think I was also a co-organizer for the Black and Neuro Week that happened on Twitter a couple of weeks ago. And one of the things that we really wanted to do was not just show intersectionality, so not just highlight Black scientists, period, but Black disabled scientists, Black queer scientists, Black trans scientists, to give them a space to celebrate the under-celebrated and the often erased. And I think in that same way, erasing any portion of someone's identity takes away from their experience. And the way that I explain it to my colleagues and my peers is the way that I talk about my science, right? So when a neuron forms, it needs both intrinsic genetic factors, but it also needs environmental signals and cues. And for me, those intrinsic factors, and for neurons, they're things that you can't change, right? Like I was born Black, I was born queer, and those extrinsic factors represent choices. So for a neuron, that's its environment, where it's going. For me, it was my decision to attend an all-women's college, my decision to go to an interdisciplinary program for graduate school. And those things come together to make my lived learned experience. So how I, as Daniel was talking about, think about science, the questions that I'm interested in asking, the experiences that I have and how I approach people. And so I think when you erase intersectionality, you just really do erase a part of a person. And by not acknowledging that it exists, you shrink them. And so I think one of the things that gives me hope for this, for intersectionality being included in these DEI initiatives is there's a new fellowship from Ben, honoring Ben Barnes, that is specifically it's for trans, non-binary, and intersect postdocs and graduate students in STEM, to give them money to go to professional development conferences. And I've never seen a fellowship like that in my life. And I was so excited about it. But I think you you have to include all of those sectors, right? My dream in academia is to have a lab where Black women are celebrated, where all people are celebrated. But for me, Black women are my passion, and making them feel supported and comfortable is my goal. So I want a lab where we listen to Meg Thee Stallion and City Girls while we write grants, where we talk about where we get our hair done and skincare products and spirituality while we run Western Blots. Like, I want all of those things because your identity is not unprofessional and should be included in those spaces.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I want to come back to Daniel before I have a couple questions for Kimberlei. Daniel, with regards to systemic racism, and you spoke a little bit about this already, what has been the role of science, in particular neuroscience, in perpetuating the fallacy of white supremacy and the marginalization of BIPOC members of our community? And why must we acknowledge this? And what does it mean to the future of neuroscience training?
So I think the problems of systemic racism that affect all disciplines affect neuroscience, of course. Us neuroscientists are part of the same societies as all our colleagues are. But neuroscience, as does, for example, genetics, I will argue, have a particular and special role, a role in bioethics topics that interface with themes that are tightly linked to the justifications that are used for sustaining systemic racism and prejudice systems. So many times the conversations try to be, the conversations that are based in biases and pseudoscience try to use scientific terms that they borrow from the neurosciences. And I will argue that our role as neuroscientists is not just to have a conversation about how we can make neuroscience more accessible, which is an important conversation, but also how we can train future generations of neuroscientists to be able to combat pseudoscience. Because the societal changes that we are facing, that we're seeing, like the soul-searching conversations that people are having, are gonna need the inputs from neuroscientists that need to, at the very least, be prepared to have those conversations or have the correct language, or at a minimum, be able to stop the wrong use of neuroscience terms to sustain pseudoscientific concepts that are then used to sustain prejudice and systemic racism. So I would like to see these conversations about the role of neuroscience in systemic racism, not just as a very true but passive conversation about how is it that we improve the neurosciences so that other neuroscientists from different backgrounds can participate. That's an important role, an important conversation to have, but it's an important conversation to have in geology, in math, in physics. But unlike geology, math, and physics, we should be talking about how concepts that we have created as a community, like IQ, are used to then perpetuate systemic racism. How concepts like intelligence are used like that. Concepts like cognition, and then what are our roles as educators and gatekeepers and creators of those concepts in combating them, or even in just staying silent when there are then arguments made by people in other fields that are like borrowing or stealing those same concepts to push agendas that are full of prejudice and hate and just corrupt society. And our silence as neuroscientists is a silence of complicitness in supporting these systems of systemic racism, more so than other scientific disciplines.
Right. So as I'm listening to you, I was thinking about the fact that in this time right now, which I don't think of as really a moment, or I really think of it as like an awakening, and that we're having to actually lean in and deal with these types of very hard questions. But a lot of times what we see is graduate students and students leading the charge in this. And so I really think that, academia, the faculty, leaders of institutions have to be involved in this conversation. And I wonder why, and maybe you can speak to this, I wonder why that's been so hard for us as maybe the faculty or the institutional framework that we have in our academic institutions. Why is it that it's the graduate students that are speaking out mostly about this, and how can we start to break that down and really lend a voice to this conversation, not just here but in all the spaces that we're doing? And is that some a mechanism of just bringing everyone to the table, or is it really getting behind closed doors and thinking about a strategic plan to make change?
I think when we face a new question as neuroscientists, we face it with respect and with recognition of the fact that our knowledge is incomplete. And somehow when we are facing these questions that are as profound, if not more profound than the scientific questions that we try to answer every day, like drawing from what KAELA was saying, using the analogy of the nervous system, just using the analogy of how we answer these questions, how come we are approaching them like we have all the answers? Like we don't, like we have not been ourselves immersed in systems of systematic racism. Like, how come there's no acknowledgement in the conversations, or frequently there's an acknowledgement missing about how the institutions, the spaces that we occupy were not designed for people like us. They were not designed for people like us. And what are the implications of that? Like, is it so that is our hypothesis that has absolutely nothing to do with the disparities that we're seeing right now in academia? And if so, what's sustaining that hypothesis as opposed to a hypothesis in which, yes, these institutions have been around for 300, 400 years, some of them, and for 2/3 of that time, most of the people participating in this conversation will not have been able to participate in the institution, no matter what the accolades will have been. Even if you had been teletransported with all your degrees to that time in history, you wouldn't have been allowed into the institution. So are those legacy structures in any way influencing today what we see? And I will argue, yes. The way that if you take the neuron trajectory, the previous trajectory influences the future trajectory. That's kind of like a commonsensical thing for me to so then when we're getting to your question, when we're having these conversations, I think there has to be an acknowledgement, a humility, to like humbleness in approaching the problem. It's a problem that is very important, very deep, that affects our science. It's a problem that we contribute to as scientists. And I think we have to, to me, victory will look like an integration of a scientific method into solving the problem, a recognition that we are ourselves immersed in frameworks in which we have been trained, in which we have normalized things that probably when we look back in 50 years are not going to appear normal to other students or future generations of neuroscientists. And our roles as scientists are to question what are those frameworks which are off. And also recognition that the knowledge that we're creating, particularly as neuroscientists today, it's likely going to be used to sustain prejudice. So we need to start training neuroscientists for that are like future trainees to be able to correctly frame that knowledge so that it's not used against their own participation in the neuroscience.
Right.
And I think that's very real. Like, I think there are going to be a lot of questions that are going to reframe what it means to be human, what it means, the human experience, who's smart, who's not, what intelligence is. And we need to have collaborations with bioethicists, particularly in the neurosciences, and start training our trainees to recognize these conversations are coming, and we need to be thoughtful in what we say so that we are not injecting our biases to exclude either marginalized groups that we're aware of now, or marginalized groups that we might not even be aware that we're marginalizing today. Like, like KAELA was talking about her identity as queer. That is something that maybe 30 years ago would not have been integrated into a conversation if we had been having that panel. So what are going to be the identities, the additive identities, because she's completely correct in saying that identities are additive. What are going to be the additive identities that we're excluding today, that we're not even aware we're excluding today? And how do we train people that are thinking about the brain to think about the product of the brain to include other scientists and to make society better? Great,
thank you for that. I'm sure if we have time for questions at the end, we'll come back to that. And yeah, it's a lot there to dig into. Kimberlei, how are you? So let's, I have, my first question for you is, about your trajectory a bit, right? So not only are you a successful neuroscientist at Howard University, but you completed both your undergrad and your doctoral degree at Howard University.
I did.
Can you speak about your experience at Howard and the important role that HBCUs have played in supporting our communities and training young people to succeed in spite of the racist culture in higher ed?
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, historically, Black colleges and universities were actually established after the Civil War, specifically to help African Americans gain access to education. And they are actually probably more important today than ever before. You know, when you really start thinking about why are they important in countering anti-racist views, one of the things is HBCUs have been known to integrate academic instruction, mentoring, support services, and above all, there's a caring community. You know, they're able to recognize inequities in post-secondary education pipeline, and they're dedicated to standing in the gap, which is critical for us in terms of ensuring that Black people receive a proper education. When you think about the fact that, you know, HBCUs only make up like less than 3% of the colleges and universities in the US, but 20% of all African American college graduates receive their degree from an HBCU. They're able to produce 25% of all of the African American graduates that have STEM degrees. And so the HBCUs really, really have a critical role in terms of advancing these anti-racist views and also training young people to succeed. I once heard that excellence is a deterrent to racism. Well, HBCUs have, of course, a history of activism related to political and civil rights. They also combat racism by building confidence in their students to go out into the world and excel in spite of the racist views. You know, HBCUs are not just culturally relevant, but they also provide that rigorous academic experience that's comparable to predominantly white institutions. What I can say is, as a double alum of Howard, I really can attest to the fact that in my experience, my professors were dedicated not only to the scholastic performance, but also to nurturing and motivating me beyond the individual limitations. They absolutely took note of what I was doing, and they also let me know when they thought I could do better. And I think that is critical to this discussion, just in terms of how we can train young people. At HBCUs, and this is just across the board, not at specific ones, but at all of them, they really take pride in nurturing the students and making sure that these students are prepared when they leave. You know, just historically, when you think about how the HBCUs have supported the community and trained young leaders to shape the nation, if you think about just examples like George Washington Carver, you know, Martin Luther King, Jesse Jackson, right, Oprah Winfrey, John Lewis, you know, Senator Kamala Harris, all of these people have been shaped by that experience. What I can say is that on a more personal note, training young people to succeed in spite of the culture really is what we do on a daily basis. I have conversations with my students about being prepared to deal with people who set low expectations for them, who spew racist views. The bottom line is I'm trying to prepare them for a world that sometimes is not kind and sometimes it's unforgiving, especially for Black women. You know, in a society where people, at least some people, are vehemently racist and disrespectful, to the point where now people are like selling T-shirts with derogatory words against the first Black woman to be nominated as vice president for a major political party. You know, it's my goal to make sure that my students get mentored, and to build their confidence in such a way that when they leave, they can stand proud, that they can represent well. You know, when they leave Howard, I want them to be proud of their Blackness, but I also want them to be able to confidently defend their science. Ultimately, this is how you train young people to succeed in spite of the racist culture. And I think the more that HBCUs continue to be a part of this, continue to focus their mission on training young people and making sure that they have the confidence that they need, that it doesn't matter what other people think of you. You know just how good you are. You know that you are just as good as anyone else. As long as we continue to do that, we are definitely on the right road, and we're making a high impact in this country as well as the world.
Right. Thank you for that. One of the things that I know, because I've had a experience of working with Howard through a partnership program that I built at UC San Diego, you guys really lean in and do a great job of building STEM identity. We've been talking about identity already. And the other thing is that there are many, I don't think people know, there are many other HBCUs, not just, I mean, we know the Howards, we know the big names, the Spelmans, but there are a lot of HBCUs, and the power of partnership with these types of institutions that are have the secret sauce to do all the things to make amazing young people come out of these programs ready to take on graduate school and in the STEM fields. I think that's definitely an opportunity that we should be looking towards. I want to ask you another question here, Kimberly. Okay. People have been talking about the theme of diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, for years, right? For years. But what does that really mean, and why without real inclusion do DEI initiatives fail? What are some of the real ideas for advancing DEI initiatives in neuroscience community and our society, especially with regards to addressing the lack of representation at the faculty level?
Okay. Couple of things in there.
Couple of things, sorry.
So I'll just first start off by really talking about what diversity, equity, and inclusion, what they really are. So diversity really focuses on the makeup of your workforce or your campus, the demographics like gender, race, age. If you think about it in terms of even pieces of a puzzle, so you may have different colors, different shapes, they all make up the puzzle, but if they're not directly connected in any way, that's pretty much like how I view diversity. So you have a puzzle, you have these multiple pieces, but they're not necessarily connected as one unit. So you have people from different numerous backgrounds at the work and all of this kind of stuff, but people aren't necessarily working together. When you think about inclusion though, this is when those pieces are entirely connected within that same puzzle. So you have the various colors and shapes, and to me, that represents an inclusive workplace where everyone has a role to play and their role is respected and it's recognized, where you can celebrate differences, and everyone, this is critical though, where everyone has the same access to opportunities, just similarly in terms of equity. Equity takes into account that different groups, require different supports. The different supports may be needed so that these different groups have equal access to the same game. And so I think it's important to, first kind of make those distinctions between what diversity is, what equity is, and what is inclusion. In terms of some ideas for advancing DEI initiatives in neuroscience, especially in terms of addressing this lack of representation at the faculty level. Wow, that's a mouthful. I think the first step, though, really is in addressing the lack of representation at the faculty level. Really, it's to acknowledge, and first you have to confront the legacy of racism, bias, and exclusions in our communities and in our schools. But the major question, I think the first question that comes to mind really is DEI really a priority for people's departments and institutions? When we're having this discussion, let's be honest about that. Is it a priority? And if it is, why is there a need for Black and Brown faculty? Undergraduate students and trainees who are underrepresented minorities, they deserve to see and interact and be taught by leaders who look like them. Kayla brought up that point, earlier, that it is really important. It means a lot to be able to see someone who's doing the thing that you would like to do. It kind of just lets you know that sometimes it can be difficult to be what you can't see. So seeing someone who looks like you in that position, of course, is important. But I think another important factor really is not just for Black and Brown students, but also for those who are of other races. I think it's important for them to see people who are Black and brown faculty in leadership positions, in authority, who have expertise. Because the bottom line is this helps to counteract some of the implicit and explicit biases that you see within departments. To me, I think there are probably 3 key issues that inhibit DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. The first is really not even recognizing the true state of DEI in the department. So that's where we come back to that first question of, is this even a priority? The second I think we have to look at is hiring practices not focused on Black and brown faculty. And the third thing, of course, is promotion and tenure, because even if you hire Black and brown faculty, people need to be able to get tenure. They need to be able to get promoted in order to stay, in order to have faculty positions. And so, we can, of course, drill down a little bit more during the chat session, but I think these are just some general comments. Really, in order to determine like the state of your department, a baseline has to be established. You need to do a survey just to assess the culture, like what is understood, what are those things within the department, because every department has different dynamics. So what are those things that are unspoken that you need to know when you're applying for tenure and promotion? I think the departments, of course, they have to be intentional. You need to set clear metrics in terms of tackling hiring practices. One of the major things is, even once Black and brown faculty get hired, how are you going to keep them? How are you going to retain them? Because oftentimes these faculty, once they get positions, they feel isolated. There's no one there who can relate to even some of the cultural similarities. So how will plans be developed to ensure that those faculty don't feel isolated when they get hired? In addition to that, there are 2 other things that I do want to mention: mentorship and championship. So these are 2 things that I think are necessary to successfully navigate and get promoted. Minorities oftentimes don't always have the specific groups in place so that, they know who to go to get information in terms of how they should put certain things together and when they should be doing certain things in certain years of their progression as faculty members. So I think it's important for every department to have some type of mechanism so that everyone has the same exposure, everyone has the same access to information. And that's going to allow people to be successful as faculty members. So these are just some things that I've been thinking about in terms of how faculty members can be retained. Because a lot of times, we've seen the numbers. There are a lot of specifically African-American students who are in a lot of the training programs. So it's not that the pipeline is necessarily leaky in that respect. These students are doing well. They're getting the grants. They're getting the K-99s and all this kind of stuff. But what we're seeing also is that there's a small number of people who are actually able. So once they get the positions, how are they able then to stay? How are they able to get tenure, to get promoted, to then be, associate professors and full professors? That's where we have to really start drilling down and trying to figure out how can we make sure that there's some things in place to ensure that these people are getting that they're getting tenure, that they're getting.
Right. Thank you for that. So, one of the things you mentioned about making sure that they're being seen, that they're being mentored. KAELA, you were involved in Black and Neuro, and I think that's a great example of highlighting, the amazing work that's neuroscience is being done by Black and brown Black scientists. And can you speak a little bit more about Black and Neuro? I know that there was a great event that happened, a month ago or a couple months ago. And before we get to our final question, and hopefully have a little bit of time to take a couple questions. So
yeah, definitely. I love being a part of Black and Neuro. Our founder, Angeline Dukes, essentially put out a tweet, and it had come after Black Birders Week and Black in the Astro and all of these sort of social media initiatives to increase the visibility of Black people in various fields. And so Angeline put out this tweet, and a bunch of us responded to it, and we're like, yeah, we would love to help and to do this. And one of the things that I think made Black in Neuro so successful was because we took that diversity, equity, and inclusion measure to another level, where we included representation, compensation, and accountability. So at the very start of Black in Neuro Week, one of a graduate student, Sharit Nolan, pointed out to us that we didn't have a Black and Disabled Day. There wasn't like a hashtag for it. We didn't include it. And we all felt incredibly bad. But instead of centering our like goodwillness in that conversation, we sat down and we recognized that we didn't include it. And we didn't include it because we were privileged enough not to realize it. So we recognized that, we acknowledged it to her directly and publicly, but also we apologized and gave her a platform to educate us and use that to educate the greater social media community about an identity that we erased, even as well-intentioned like founders and makers of a social media movement. And that's what I mean when I talk about accountability and why it's so important. So you can put, like Kimberlei was saying, you can increase the number of Black and brown people in your institution, in your department, but if you're not giving them the space to call you out when things are bad, if you're not giving them the tools to succeed and to thrive, what are they really doing there? Because they're doing twice as much work, twice as much emotional labor, just trying to stay and keep their head above water. And I think that that's something that those DEI movements really miss, is the amount of emotional labor that goes into existing as a Black or brown person, just period. Like all other additive identities aside, just existing in this space that wasn't made for you, period, but also wasn't made for you to excel in. And so I really think Black in Neuro Week worked super well because we were all committed to that goal, and we had all seen these DEI initiatives from universities and committees fail in that way. And we were like, we won't do that. Okay.
All right. One last question, and then we'll open up for take a couple questions from the audience. And Kayla, you were just speaking, so we're going to start with you. What does success or victory look like?
Yeah. So to me, victory and success, it looks like having more Black and brown people stay in science and be happy. It's more these Black in weeks and initiatives. It's removing the tone policing from conversations about Blackness, about race, about queerness and identity. It's having more Black and brown women in positions of power where they feel confident and emboldened to make change. It's really about teaching Black and brown trainees how to unlearn all of the things, all of their traumas from graduate school and life, and to walk into new environments and feel empowered. And so that's what it looks like for me. It just looks like a bunch of happiness.
Great, great. Daniel.
Yeah, to me, it looks like being aware of what we don't know. Like, I mean, right now, like Kayla was just talking about accountability in a very nice way about how this case of the disabled person in the conversations of Black in Neuro. There's always something that we don't know, and we cannot be afraid about our own prejudices. We have to be aware that we all carry frameworks that help us in many circumstances, but in other circumstances might hurt other people. And the more privileged you are, the more your frameworks are helpful to you and not to others. And it's about creating an awareness of that. It's about creating spaces in academia where, when Kimberlei was talking about faculty feeling isolated, what I heard is that faculty feel like they cannot live through all their identities, like this plurality of identities, bring them to bear for the service of themselves, their colleagues, and science, because at the end, science benefits from this too. I really believe that. So victory to me looks like, yes, of course, the emergent property of having more faculty of color, more Black faculty, that's like an emergent property like thought is for the brain. But the building blocks of it is a recognition that we have to like have an introspection about the systems that we occupy and our roles in it, and what we know and what we don't know, and use the scientific method to dig through that.
Okay. Kimberlei.
Victory. What does victory look like? Victory is, to me, it's living in a society that values everyone. It's not just about just maintaining a faculty position, but it's also about being in positions of power to influence decisions and ultimately to make our society better. You know, true change happens when administrators, when the policymakers, when community leaders work really in an authentic way to create an environment that truly embraces diversity, equity, and inclusion values. I think on a broader scale, success and victory are represented when there is equitable justice. When people don't have to declare in the streets that Black lives matter, you know, success is when we know that lives matter and our society respects and honors the fact that we matter. I think even as a challenge to everyone who's looking at this webinar, you know, become more active, give to organizations that promote like anti-racist views, denounce those things that promote racist agendas. Talk to your own kids about being anti-racist. Be intentional about the change that you want to see. We can all influence our own spheres of influence. You know, all of the things that we've been talking about, you know, in terms of how to help faculty and how to make our departments better and the training experiences better. Ultimately, though, we want our society to be better. And so we need to be intentional about getting to know someone who doesn't look like you. Like that alone, you know, whether it's in your department or your school or even at a neuroscience conference, being able to reach out and just kind of, you know, try to learn and appreciate and respect other people's differences, that to me, that's what victory is.
Okay, so we are running out of time, but I want to pose one question that came up, and I'll actually start by giving my thoughts on it. How do us as panelists, moderators, scientists, Black and brown scientists, how do we balance and integrate our identities as scientists and with our identities as Black or brown individuals, our gender, our ethnicities, and the work that we do, right? We're scientists, and we're also people from communities that typically don't send scientists to you know, major universities. The representation is not there. For me, I'm trying to balance my identity and the work that I do, because I love science, but I'm also a kid from the inner city of South Central, Compton, California, and my mom had me at 16 years of age, and here I am now, 16 years into my faculty position, full professor, and I want to see change. I want to see more individuals like me from my community know that this is for them also. And so it's for me, balancing my identity as a Black man is always, there's this challenge when I'm trying to struggle against the institutionalized racism, the microaggressions, the things in place that people don't even understand works against me. And also the extra work that I'm always given, not because it's just there and it's equitably laid out and given to faculty. It's actually given to me because I want this work. I want to do this work, but I'm happy and enthused when I see my colleagues try to step up also to work against racism, to make a change in our communities at our university, because we can't do it all by ourselves. We have to do it as a community. So for me, you know, there's always that struggle of knowing where I came from, knowing that there's very few people that look like me in these spaces, and knowing that I want to somehow build a bridge and make that pipeline happen. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment there. I don't know if there's any other questions. Let's see.
I think I'll comment really quickly. I think
go ahead, KAELA.
With what Kimberly was saying, I try to balance this by not thinking of my identities as separate. Like, I'm Black first. I'm a Black queer woman, and I'm always Black first. And so when I take on like service projects or extra things that I want to do, I do them, as Daniel was saying, from the framework of a scientist, because that's who I am. So I'm a Black queer developmental neuroscientist. That's who I am every day in every room I walk into. And so I try really hard to be intentional with my time, intentional with language and the way that I communicate about my struggles to everybody, like not just students, but also to faculty members when I'm asking for change about like, this is who I am as a holistic person. So it's again, for me, that not changing yourself or shrinking yourself or prioritizing different aspects of your identity, just coming through holistically and being like, help all of me.
I agree. I think also you have to be very intentional about what are the deal breakers for you. You know what I mean? Like what is really, really important. You should set up, you can't do everything, but at least set maybe like 1 to 2 things that are always, whatever you do, that's the theme surrounding it. So if your thing is trying to increase the number of Black and brown people who are coming into neuroscience, then no matter what you do, whether that's speaking at schools, whether that's talking to your own cousins and, you know, going back to your elementary schools or your high schools, that kind of like, that is what you do. And so I think what I have, well, it's been a challenge for me too. I totally understand what you're saying in terms of not having to.
And we are almost out of time. I'll let you have the final word here.
Oh, but I was just going to say, I do think that it can be done, but I just really, really want to emphasize the fact that start with your own sphere of influence.
Right.
That's how change occurs.
All right, so we're going to have a quick break, and then we're going to come back on for our next panel. Thank you to all the panelists. This was fantastic. I really appreciate the words that you lend to this entire community that's on the webinar right now. And leaning in with the transparency and empathy for yourselves and for everyone within our neuroscience community. So thank you.